Welcome to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Digital Open House. My name is Nate Pamplin, and I'm the Policy Director with the department. We are your lead state agency charged with conserving the state's fish and wildlife resources and providing sustainable opportunities. To name just a few areas where we work, we recover threatened species, we permit hydraulic projects that affect aquatic life, we enforce state fish and wildlife laws, we manage game species, recreational and commercial fisheries, and over 80 hatcheries. We partner with private landowners to improve habitat and provide public access. We work with the agricultural community to resolve wildlife conflicts, and we manage over 1 million acres of wildlife habitat and 700 water access sites. Tonight, we have members of the department's leadership team assembled to provide you an update on some high-profile projects, as well as host a Q&A later this evening. We'll begin with Director Kelly Susewind providing some opening remarks. We'll then turn to Kayal, addicts, the Intergovernmental Salmon Manager, who will share an update from the 2019 north of Falcon salmon season setting process. Jeff Davis, who's the Assistant Director of the Habitat Program, will present an overview of the department's role in conserving salmon. Kelly Cunningham, who is the Deputy Assistant Director of our Fish Program, will discuss the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement. We'll then shift to wolves, where Eric Gardner, the Wildlife Program's Assistant Director, will walk us through some public processes that will kick off in a few months about wolf conservation and management. Eric will be followed by Tim Burns, who is the Assistant Director of our Capital Asset Management Program, who will provide an overview of our recent capital budget investments. And then we'll close out the panel tonight with Chief Steve Bear, who leads our law enforcement program, and he'll share some priorities for the enforcement program for this upcoming spring and summer. We'll then spend some time with a Q&A session and be able to respond to your questions. We also have on our panel tonight Joe Storr, who's our Deputy Director, and he'll be our pinch hitter tonight. To submit a question to the panel, please click the chat button, and you'll need to enter your name and submit your email. The chat dialog box will then open, and you can type your message to us. Please include your name and the town where you reside in your message. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions, and if we can't answer it, or you think of a follow-up question later, please just send us an email to director@dfw.wa.gov, and we'll route your question to someone that can best provide a response. So with that, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll now turn it over to Director Kelly Susewind.
Thank you, Nate. I'd like to just kick this off first with a big thank you to all of you that are out watching this tonight or will watch it when it's recorded later. We are working hard and are definitely committed to increasing the transparency of the agency and improving our interaction with the public, our constituency. That would be you, and we hope that this is a valuable tool to achieve that goal. I will say that we're on a learning curve with this, so we welcome input on how we're doing and how we could do better, if we're hitting the right topics, if this format works for you, et cetera, and we can address that again towards the end. So Nate walked through the crowd of folks we've got here. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of information. We put this group together based on the things that are occupying most of our time at the current point in the year, also the issues that we know you all want to hear about most often. So, for example, Kyle's going to walk you through the north of Falcon process. That's the process where we set salmon fishing seasons throughout primarily Puget Sound and the coast. I just finished my first north of Falcon process this year. It is by far the most complex and controversial issue I've ever dealt with. It's also something we hear the most about, and I find that when people, part of the confusion is they don't really understand the process. So we're hopeful that Kyle walking through this can give you an idea of what's involved, what constrains or informs decisions, and so that we can continue a strong dialogue on exactly what happens at north of Falcon. It's going to be a disappointing result when we have disappointing returns at north of Falcon. That means less opportunity for fishing. The best way we can address that is improving those runs and do some get to restoration. I'm glad to say at north of Falcon this year we had more time vested in habitat and recovery than we have in the past. And we have Jeff Davis here tonight to talk about salmon recovery. Jeff also represented us on that angle at north of Falcon. No webinar that I've been involved with so far, or public meeting, could not involve wolves. It is by far, if anything, rivals north of Falcon. It's wolves for controversy and energy in the issue. We hear about it everywhere we go. The good news, I don't want to take too much of Eric Gardner's time or to steal his thunder. Wolves are doing well. Eric's going to give you an update on the status of those wolves and probably more importantly, opportunities you might have to engage with us as we continue on the path to recovery for wolves here in Washington. The thing we don't have a specific presentation on tonight that I want to touch base with is our legislative session. We've just wrapped up the last session. It's a biennial session, meaning it covers both years. It's a long session. And for us, to be honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the good side, there are significant new resources invested in killer whale recovery. The governor developed his task force. The legislature listened. Significant new influx of resources and energy and new work to recover killer whales. We have investments in increased production for salmon to feed the whales. That production goes to both state, tribal, and PUD facilities. So that's a good opportunity to improve the situation. We also have improvements in prey availability. What are we going to do not only to make sure that the prey is out there, but the orcas have access to them. This goes all the way from some habitat type issues to make sure we have the forage fish, to make sure that we have the entire chain supported up through the killer whales. Another great investment for the state. And lastly, a significant investment in vessel traffic. Vessels create a noise, making it difficult for the whales to find and locate their prey. So a big investment in monitoring that. So that side of the equation from the legislature, I think, is a success story for the state, for the orcas, and for our agency. Unfortunately, the rest of the news is not as rosy for us. The big issue for us is the legislature did not fund our budget request this year, and that perpetuates a long-term cyclical problem we've been having. So to define the problem, several biennia ago, we went in for an increased budget. Our cost of doing business goes up, just like any business. Rather than getting that funding and getting it on an ongoing basis, we got a one-time infusion of money, not quite enough to cover the budget hole. The bigger part of that problem is at the end of the biennium, that money goes away, and our costs have gone up even further. So the hole is bigger the next biennium, which we habitually go to the legislature, ask to plug that hole on an ongoing basis, and we get another one-time partial fix. So our budget ask at the beginning of the biennium to cover those deficits has grown from in the $7 million range at three biennia ago to $20 million to this year, $30 million budget ask. We put a lot of energy into it this year, partially at the direction of the legislature last year when they provided what I'll call the bridge funding. They said, go do your homework and make sure that you know what you're asking for and why you're asking for it. They told us to do a third-party assessment of our budget, basically to make sure that we weren't causing a budget hole through performance, that it was indeed a structural problem. That came out good for us. We compared well with other state agencies and other fish and wildlife agencies through the country. We also worked with a budget advisory group to make sure that we're working on our highest priority efforts. That's a zero-based budgeting effort. And that same group of diverse constituents, the people, hopefully a lot are watching tonight, they represent you, telling us where they think we should be directing our efforts and helping us develop the long-term plan. The long-term plan this year was to go to the legislature with a mix of increased budget request. That came from a general fund ongoing request and a fee bill. Unfortunately, the fee bill did not pass. That also included a Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement that Kelly Cunningham's going to walk you through. And so we ended up with less than we needed to get through the biennium, which means we're not going to be able to provide the services we had hoped to. To put it in perspective, we went in with a $31 million ask on an ongoing basis. The legislature gave us $24 million to cover the biennium. They also passed a lot of provisions that further increased our costs. Those increased costs came without additional revenue. Bottom line is we're facing about a $20 million shortfall to make it through the next 2-year cycle. One tool that helped us manage, the legislature appropriated more money the first year than the second year. We've had some discussions with the budget writers and those influential in the budget writing process in the legislature. And the intent appears to be that they want us to come as close as we can to staying whole in this first year, recognizing we don't have enough to do that, and they fully anticipate we'll be in with a big budget ask next year. So we're working hard right now to figure out what we can afford, particularly over the coming year, and how we structure ourselves in a way to be successful at next year's supplemental ask. That would be an ask for the second year of the biennium. Again, to put it in perspective, this budget hole at the beginning of the biennium has grown each biennium. And without a change, we'll go into the 21-23 biennium with approximately a $46 million hole. So it's gone from 10 to 20 to 30 to 46. That doesn't count any additional costs that will, or cost of doing business that could increase between now and then. So disappointing, but we've got some direction to try to do the best we can to get through this year and then come back. And so we'll be working hard at doing exactly that. On the that's our operating budget that actually operates, our agency uses to operate. On the capital side, which is what we use to build things, and Tim Burns is going to walk you through that budget, it's a little rosier picture. $53 million in new appropriations, $58 million in reappropriations, so work we had already begun. Significant investment, significant, I think, demonstration of trust in the work the agency does. That's largely a result of Tim's great work and building that trust and coming through and spending that money in efficient and productive ways. So so Tim will walk you through what that looks like. Lastly, we'll wrap up with Chief Bear. Every time I go out and do public meetings, folks want to know where we stand on enforcement, what's our enforcement priorities, how and where are we investing our enforcement resources. So the Chief will walk you through that tonight. Following that, as Nate said, we will have a question and answer. Frankly, that's the part of the evening I think is most beneficial to me. It's certainly, I think, where we learn what your interests are, and it gives us an opportunity to either provide answers at the time or follow up with you on those issues that are of most importance to you. So that's my kickoff. I'll reserve some time for the end, and we'll get started. And that start is with Kayal Addicts to walk us through this year's North of Falcon salmon season setting process.
Thank you for the introduction, Director. I am Kayal Addicts, the Intergovernmental Salmon Manager with the Fish Program. I'm going to give a relatively brief, given the complexities you mentioned with North of Falcon, a relatively brief presentation on the North of Falcon process. Jumping into the slides here, I'm going to start with a brief overview of the salmon management landscape that we work in, a brief description of what the North of Falcon process is, and get into some specifics of 2019, the challenges that we faced with season planning and the outcomes of the process. So as salmon leave our freshwater and nearshore marine areas and swim up the coast and back, they don't honor political boundaries. They swim across state lines and international boundaries. So salmon management happens in a variety of forums. The broadest of those is the Pacific Salmon Treaty process. The Pacific Salmon Treaty was originally signed in 1985, and it put limits on the interceptions of salmon in fisheries in Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and the southern United States. Pieces of that treaty have been renegotiated in the years since 1985. Most recently, we reached agreement with Canada on new Chinook, Coho, and Chum chapters that went into effect in 2019. Particularly the Chinook portion of that renewed treaty should result in some reductions in interceptions of Washington fish as they head down the coast and provide some benefits to our stocks in Washington. Moving into the southern United States, the Pacific Fishery Management Council was created by the Magnuson-Stevens Act along with the other fishery management councils around the country. The Pacific Fishery Management Council oversees fisheries off the Pacific coast in the economic exclusion zone from the U.S.-Canada border all the way south to the U.S.-Mexico border. The state of Washington, along with the states of Oregon, California, and Idaho all have seats on that council, as do the treaty tribes, NOAA, and a number of others. Moving into state waters in Washington, we have the U.S. v. Washington and U.S. v. Oregon court cases that set much of the legal basis for management in Puget Sound, the Columbia River, and the coast of Washington. Each year we plan the fisheries with state constituents and the tribal co-managers through what we call the North of Falcon process. So one of the most common questions we get from new participants or people who want to know what North of Falcon is what is North of Falcon? North of Falcon refers to the ocean area north of Cape Falcon, Oregon. So on the map on the right side of the slide, there's a dark line that says Cape Falcon. Fisheries north of that, both in the ocean and our freshwater and inshore marine areas, are planned through the north of Falcon process. Washington stocks generally migrate north as they head out into the ocean waters, so our fish tend to stay in areas north of this for the most part. The process is an intensive 7-week process to set the salmon fishing seasons in all of those marine and freshwater areas north of Cape Falcon. Chinook and coho usually get most of the attention, but we set seasons for all 5 species, pink, chum, and sockeye, as well as Chinook and coho. We deal with more than 25 tribes through the process. And as we set seasons, we have to make sure that we're meeting our Pacific Salmon Treaty obligations, that we're following the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery and Conservation Act, and that we're being consistent with the long list of federal court decisions that have guided us over the years. We also have to make sure we meet all of our Endangered Species Act requirements. A number of our stocks are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and there are requirements for having fisheries that affect those stocks. And finally, we have to be consistent with both our Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission policies and Washington state law. It's a really complex process, but if we try to break it down into some simple steps, each year the process begins as state and tribal biologists around the state develop preseason forecasts for the number of fish that are expected to return that year, and we figure out what our conservation objectives are for each stock, so the maximum impact we can have for fisheries. We have a lot of management plans that guide us on those conservation objectives, but a lot of those are dependent on the abundance of a stock in a given year. If the forecast is better, the stock can have a little higher impact in fisheries. If the forecast is bad, we have to limit fisheries more. Once we have those forecasts and objectives set, we go through a long series of public and co-manager meetings to try to work out fisheries around the state that will meet all of the objectives for all of our species and stocks. And at the end of the process, we hope to have that agreement on fisheries that meets all of our objectives. This is just the meeting schedule for public meetings in 2019. The dates vary from year to year, but the basic structure is usually pretty similar. In late February, we have a public meeting where we tell everyone what the forecasts are for this year and start talking about what fishing opportunities might look like, given the constraints with stocks that are doing well or not. Over the next month and a half after that, we have a number of meetings, but the bookends are the Pacific Fishery Management Council meetings, the first of which happens in March. At that meeting, the Pacific Fishery Management Council sets the options for ocean fishing for the upcoming year. Over the next month, we have meetings everywhere from Clarkston to Westport and a lot of places in between to take public input on what the fisheries might look like, what the public wants out of the fisheries for that year, given the constraints. And then finally, in mid-April is the final Pacific Fishery Management Council meeting where the final ocean fisheries are set, and then we line up all of the inside fisheries, state and tribal, to make sure that we're meeting all of our objectives. There's also a long series of meetings that go on with our co-managers around the state during this time, where we talk with the tribes about their fisheries, our fisheries, and try to come up with a plan that meets all of our objectives. It's also worth mentioning we took a step into live streaming several of our public meetings this year. So the February 27th meeting, as well as the March 19th and April 3rd meetings, were live streamed and also recorded. So they're available for viewing on our website if anyone wants to go back and look at those. Puget Sound generally gets a lot of the attention at north of Falcon. So tonight I'm going to kind of focus on Puget Sound and some of the challenges we faced in 2019. Probably the biggest challenge is just that Puget Sound Chinook Abundance has not improved since the time of the SA listing. Puget Sound Chinook were listed in 1999, and the abundance has not improved in spite of all the time, effort, dollars spent on recovering these fish since then. We needed to reach state tribal agreement on fisheries that meet all of our conservation objectives for all stocks and obtain ESA authorization from NOAA. We knew going in that the ESA limits for Stillaguamish, Nooksack, and Mid-Hood Canal Chinook were likely to put some significant restraints on fisheries this year. We're also coming off a number of years of poor coho returns. We have rebuilding plans that are about to be finalized for the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Snohomish coho due to poor escapements for a number of years in the recent past. So as we plan fisheries, we need to focus on rebuilding those coho stocks. And we also have a Pacific Salmon Treaty obligation to limit our impact on a Canadian stock, Thompson River coho, which in many years in the past has limited our coho fisheries. Southern resident killer whales have gotten a lot of attention over the last year or two, particularly the spotlight from the governor's task force. So we needed to continue to consider the potential effects of our fisheries on southern residents, not just prey availability effects, but also vessel interaction effects. And finally, we face some challenges with Puget Sound chum management. For the past decade or so, the return to many North Sound rivers have been very poor, and there's concern from our tribal co-managers about some individual populations in South Puget Sound. So we spent a fair amount of time talking about chum management, how to rebuild those North Puget Sound stocks, and how to make sure that we don't let our Southern Puget Sound stocks slip to low abundances. This is just a graph that kind of gets to the first point on the last slide. It shows the number of Chinook returning to Puget Sound since 1975. The light blue line at the bottom of the graph is the wild Chinook abundance, and there are two red lines on that graph. The first one is the wild 10-year average leading up to the time of listing in 1999, and that average was 39,300 Chinook. The most recent 10 years of data, we have a wild 10-year average of 28,200 Chinook. So about a 28% decline in the wild abundance since the time of listing in 1999. Again, that's one of the real challenges we face each year. To get into some of the specifics on the season development, I need to explain a little basic fishery management terminology. I know a lot of people watching tonight probably aren't familiar with all of our terms, but a lot of our harvest limits are defined as exploitation rates, and that's the percentage of the population that can be impacted by fisheries within a given year. So as we plan the year's fisheries, we have to make sure that we don't exceed the exploitation rate limits for each stock. And as we start planning our fisheries, one of the first things we do is model our previous year's fisheries with the current year's forecast. So this year we looked at the fisheries we planned in 2018, used our model with the forecast for 2019 to see what our projected impacts on each stock would be. And these are the three stocks I mentioned earlier. The Stillaguamish exploitation rate was 16.7% using last year's fisheries, and we faced an 8% limit this year. So we're nearly double the rate we needed to be as we started planning fisheries for this year. And Mid-Hood Canal was at 13.5% in southern U.S. fisheries versus a 12% limit, and Nooksack at 11.2% southern U.S. limit versus southern U.S. rate versus a 10.5% limit. These fish swim all over Puget Sound and out into the ocean and are caught at different rates in different fisheries. So it's a complicated task to get each of these rates down to the numbers they need to be through adjusting fisheries. This is a map of our Puget Sound marine catch areas. Again, a lot of people watching tonight might not be familiar with these, so I'll just kind of walk through them. To the left of the map is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Area 5 is the catch area out to the west of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Moving to the east, Area 6 is the next area from the Strait of Juan de Fuca over to Whidbey Island. Area 7 at the top of the map is the area around the San Juan Islands up to the U.S.-Canada border at Point Roberts. Moving back to the south, Area 8-1 is the marine area around the mouth of the Skagit River. Area 8-2, the marine area around the mouths of the Stillaguamish and Snohomish rivers. Area 9 is the Admiralty Inlet area, the west side of Whidbey Island. Area 10, the area around Seattle. Area 11, the area around Tacoma. Area 12 is Hood Canal, and Area 13 is deep South Puget Sound, the area south of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. As we started to develop seasons, we knew that we needed some big reductions to the Stillaguamish exploitation rate, and that was going to mean some changes to summer fisheries for this year. And per our Commission's guidance in their North of Falcon policy, we try to balance fishing opportunity between areas within all of our other management constraints. So we looked at the scale of reductions that were needed between areas to have similar reductions on that Stillaguamish rate. One of the first areas we looked at closing was Area 7 in the month of August, which has about a 0.7% exploitation rate on Stillaguamish Chinook. And about 10,000 angler trips on average would be expected for Area 7 in that month of August. When we started looking at other marine areas and what would need to be closed to get a similar reduction, if we were to close Area 5 from July through September, Area 6 from July through September, Area 9 from July through September, and Area 11 for the month of July, that would add up to a similar 0.7% reduction on Stillaguamish ER. And the combination of angler trip averages for those areas would be around 160,000 angler trips. So that was one of the tough decisions we made, was to close Area 7 for the month of August. But in looking at what it would have taken in closures to other areas, thought that it made the most sense. We had to make some other changes to meet the Stillaguamish and the other exploitation rate ceilings. Again, we closed Area 7 in August, but also in January. Area 5 for 2 weeks in February. Area 6 in February. Areas 8-1 and 8-2 in December and January. Area 9 for 10 days in July and January. And Area 11 in June, October, and December. So some significant reductions, and these are in terms of closures from areas that were open last year. It's kind of hard to visualize what this looks like without knowing what areas were open and what months in the past. So this is a table we use as we go through the process to note what's open and what closed in our various potential fishery plans. To orient you to this one, the black boxes are times and areas that were closed last year and will be closed again this year. The gray M's are areas and times that are open for mark selective fishing for Chinook. The dark gray boxes within are areas that are open to fishing for salmon, but with non-retention of Chinook, so primarily open for coho fishing. And finally, the red portions are the areas that were closed for 2019. These line up with the areas that were on the map on the previous page. So significant closures this year, but significant salmon fishing remains open around the Sound. Anywhere from 4 months to 12 months, depending on the area, remain open this year. This is another kind of complicated table, but one we spend a lot of time looking at through the North of Falcon process. On the left side is a list of the stocks that we manage for. Those stocks are grouped into 15 management units. The center columns are the management criteria, so these are the ESA limits that we're managing each of those management units for. And the right side are the model predictions. So with our final fishery package, this is what we expect the impact of our fisheries to be on that stock. And just note that there are 2 stocks that are at their maximum allowable exploitation rates, and those Nooksack Springs and Stillaguamish summer fall Chinook, with the fisheries planned, are at their ESA limits for the year. Also notice that the escapement for these stocks are relatively small, just over 200 for Nooksack Springs and just less than 1,000 for Stillaguamish. So while these exploitation rates are hard to understand, the actual numbers of fish we're dealing with here are really small. So it's really hard to find what we need to do to fisheries to have our bare minimum impact on these stocks. Just as we wrapped up the North of Falcon process in Washington, British Columbia announced their fishing regulations for the year with some unprecedented reductions to the fisheries up there. If I walk through the map here, off the west coast of Vancouver Island, their commercial troll fishery will not open till August 1st. The recreational fishery off the west coast of Vancouver Island will not allow Chinook retention until July 15th. Moving into the southern Strait of Georgia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, they will be Chinook non-retention through the month of July, and then in August allow 1 Chinook per day. And in the Fraser River, it will be closed to salmon fishing through August 23rd, and then open but not allow retention of Chinook. So British Columbia is facing some similar really tough conservation issues, particularly with Fraser River Chinook, and took some big reductions this year in their fishery plans. Kind of our summarized key outcomes for 2019. The key outcome really every year and this year is to provide fishing opportunities consistent with expected abundances and conservation goals for all species. In spite of the reductions to Chinook fishing opportunities in some areas this year, we're still expecting good Chinook fishing during the openings and also expecting coho fishing to be much improved this year around the state as the populations recover from the drop-off we saw back in 2015. We also expect with the fisheries plan, we will meet all of our conservation goals this year. Other key outcomes were to reach state tribal agreement for all of our fisheries and to obtain ESA authorization for Puget Sound fisheries. Our ESA authorization ran through April 30th of this year. We needed to complete our state tribal fishing plan, submit that to NOAA for analysis to get coverage for the upcoming year. And we did receive that authorization that covers our fisheries through April 30th of 2020. That's the end of my presentation, but I hope everyone gets out there and enjoys some fishing and sunsets around the sound, around the state this year. With that, I will hand it off to Jeff Davis, our Habitat Program Assistant Director, to talk about salmon recovery and WDFW's role.
Thanks, Kyle. Jeff Davis, Assistant Director, oversee the Habitat Program, have the amazing privilege and honor to serve all of you in regards to habitat needs. Feel very privileged and honored to serve the department and represent the amazing staff of the Habitat Program. The focus tonight is on salmon, although I do want to emphasize that the department does a lot of really important habitat work, both on our own lands, on other public lands, as well as private lands. So if you take care of all fish and wildlife, then salmon are in a good space. But I'll focus tonight on salmon recovery. So some of our biggest challenges, as you might imagine, are us. This slide shows the projected human population growth between now and 2040. So we're about 7.2 million humans strong in the state of Washington, and we have about 2 million more coming between now and 2040. Some of these areas on the map might surprise folks because we'll see pretty dramatic increases in folks coming into these particular areas, which will pose another conservation challenge for us. I think about kind of what our current state of habitat conditions are, and then some of the challenges we're seeing just with how we've developed over the past several decades. And I think there's some significant opportunities to change how we develop across the landscape so that we are minimizing and restoring some of these areas to improve fish and wildlife conservation and opportunities. Another challenge that we are facing in fish and wildlife conservation or salmon recovery is climate change. This slide shows projected stream temperature increases. So in the upper right, you see the historic. So this is around pre-listing time, and then you see through time how these streams are projected to warm up. So climate change brings not just warming streams, we're also projected to see smaller snowpacks as well as increased flooding and then drought conditions in the summertime. So our salmon and steelhead are going to have some real challenges. The good news is we know about those challenges, and we'll talk about some opportunities to address these issues moving forward. Kyle stole my slide. I'm not upset about that. The good news is he knows this slide better than I do, so I'll work quickly through it. I want to highlight some folks that I've talked with in the public are like, hey, these fish were listed in '99. We've invested a lot of time and money, and the populations are still going down. While we could all talk about how much has been invested and how much is needed to be invested in order to achieve success, I do want to point out that we have had some successes. Skagit River in particular is one where we're seeing increases in natural origin Chinook numbers. While we're not totally done with all the potential opportunities in the Skagit, We do have a template or a model to follow as we move around the different watersheds. I do also want to highlight that Hood Canal Summer Chum is another potential success story for us. It's one that touches all the H's, the harvest, hatcheries, habitat, maybe not hydro. But those are dangerously close to us making a push for potential delisting of that, as well as a lot of progress being made on mid-Columbia steelhead. So it is totally possible with some fish passage, with some habitat restoration, some in-stream flow. These fish are pretty resilient and can show a rebound. So the title of the presentation was Habitat Increasing Focus. And I think that's Habitat Program's task here. The director mentioned me attending north of Falcon. I think it was really impactful for me to see a team of maybe some of the best salmon managers in the world under maybe some of the biggest constraints and pressures, trying to deliver the best for all of you out there that salmon fish. And I got to learn about what are some of the constraints that are operating in that system, and look at that through the habitat lens, and be able to come back and sit down with the habitat program and say, all right, we got a lot of work to do. So how do we focus in? This slide shows the important stocks to southern resident orca. Ironically, I think Kyle had a list of, or mentioned, some of the constraining stocks on the salmon fisheries, and surprisingly or not, there's some significant overlap in this map in those constraining stocks. So I'm going to run through really quickly some of the tools that the department uses to protect habitat as well as restore habitat. The big one, as you might imagine, 7.2 million people with 2 million more people coming, is land use. So as I mentioned a little earlier, we got to figure out a way to help those people land on the landscape in a way that's much softer than we've developed in the past, and at the same time maybe restore, I use terms like soften or green, some of our urban areas so that those areas contribute more to a functional habitat in the watershed. And on the right side, the reason I put this in here is I think we have a tendency as a species to carve things up into neat boxes, and watersheds just simply don't function that way. They're all interconnected, and these watersheds serves as a conveyor belt, both upstream and downstream, if it's fish, but also upstream and downstream if it's wildlife. So we're working every square inch of these watersheds as we use these tools. Another really important tool we have, and this is, we talk internally about direct authority. That's authority we have to protect or restore, in this case, fish, and then indirect authority, where we're referenced in other people's authorities like the Growth Management Act and the Shoreline Management Act. This fish protection, it's the Hydraulic Project Approval Authority, and the department reviews about 3,000 hydraulic projects a year, and we issue about 2,700 decisions. The objective of those decisions is to ensure that people doing the work are avoiding, minimizing, and then compensating for any potential impacts to fish or fish habitat. Our big role here, in my experience, is we get project designs in and we work to influence modifications to those projects so that they do avoid, minimize, and compensate for impacts to fish. And I should also say we had a pretty monumental year in the legislature. For decades, the department has relied on our criminal authority to enforce this particular law. And we've been, as you might imagine, some of these violations of this law do reach that criminal level, but many are just folks that didn't really know. And so we had historically insufficient civil authority to go out and help people come into compliance. And this last legislative session, we finally, after decades of trying, received some enhancements to our existing civil authority so that we can help people come into voluntary compliance, and if not, we can ensure that we're restoring impacts to fish from violations. Fish passage has been in the news quite a bit. The department chairs the Fish Barrier Removal Board. That's one entity that prioritizes and distributes money for correcting fish passage barriers. We also work pretty heavily with the Department of Transportation on identifying their barriers, prioritizing those, and we'll continue to lean in. Unfortunately, the Department of Transportation needed about $275 million for their federal injunction work, and they only received $100 million. So we'll continue to work with them in the legislature to make sure that they can make progress on the federal culvert injunction. We're also working with local and other state agencies and private landowners to identify and seek funding for the removal of barriers on their property. And then another really important fish passage one is working with the tribes and the federal government to improve fish passage around dams. The screen, the picture on the right of the screen, little known fact, the department may have the best fish or water diversion screening program in the country. That's where we design and manufacture water diversion screens. And those are really important because we have a lot of irrigation and domestic water diversions from streams and rivers. And what we don't want is salmon and steelhead getting into the irrigation canals and being lost to the population. The department plays a huge role in habitat restoration actions. This is one where we've done some significant work while we're trying to recover salmon by doing habitat restoration, estuary restoration on our DFW lands. We're also doing that in a way to ensure that current uses and opportunities aren't replaced simply. So there's a balancing act there, but the department has done a significant job in restoring estuary function in particular on our lands, and those are huge for smolt survival and increases in smolt numbers. I would be remiss if I didn't also highlight that we are heavily involved in the Columbia system, the federal energy projects like hydro dams, where we're your representative, I guess, in relicensing negotiations, where we talk about additional habitat restoration, additional hatchery production, if necessary, and fish passage needs around these structures, both upstream and downstream. Another big one that's underway right now, we're working with the tribes, Department of Ecology, and the federal government, and Oregon actually, on some what we term flex spill in the Columbia system, and that will result in minimizing impacts to ratepayers, energy ratepayers, but also significant increases in smolt survivability downstream. And then water projects. We are hand in hand with Department of Ecology in working together to make sure that we have adequate in-stream flows so that we're maximizing salmon and steelhead habitat by keeping the water in streams and rivers, restoring those where they've been diminished through time. And we work with them to do the water science, so the impact of water on salmon and steelhead in particular, as well as reviewing and providing feedback on individual water rights that may impact fish and wildlife. So I brought all of those tools, and that is by far not all of the tools in the Habitat toolbox here at the department. But I'll close in saying, like, so Jeff, what are you doing for us on for Orca and salmon recovery and salmon fishing? The program is going through a pretty extensive effort to really take a look at where those biggest constraints are to Orca salmon and salmon fishery recovery. And we'll be focusing in the right tools in these areas to kind of increase our emphasis so that we can work with our partners, the tribes, local governments, conservation districts, regional fishery enhancement groups, et cetera, NGOs, to try to bring more resources to bear in these watersheds that need a lot more help than maybe others, while we continue to do habitat protection and restoration work in the surrounding watersheds. So with that, leave on a positive note. We're going to do this, and maybe I'm naive, but I don't think I am. Our future depends on it. So the good news is, if you're interested in this, please get a hold of me. It's going to take all of us to do this. There's been a pretty substantial network, but having more citizens involved in habitat protection and restoration can only ensure that we have improved policies and improved funding in order to accomplish what's laid out in front of us here. And we're going to do it, and we're working hard to make sure that we can restore fish and wildlife in the state that are your property. So I will conclude. Next up is Kelly Cunningham, and he'll be talking with you about the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement.
Thank you, Jeff. Again, my name's Kelly Cunningham. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director for the Fish Program here at Fish and Wildlife. I'll be able to make up a little bit of time for us. I only have a few slides, but what I want to talk about today is one of the challenges that the Director mentioned, and it's a pretty significant challenge for us, and that is the expiration or the sunset of the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement. Thought we'd start off by providing a little background information. We'll then talk about the revenue that was generated by the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement and the fisheries that are supported by that revenue. And then we'll wrap things up by talking about the 2019 legislative session as it relates to the endorsement. So by way of background, and as a result of the Great Recession and declining general fund appropriations from the legislature to the department, a grassroots effort was lodged by recreational anglers, and that grassroots effort resulted in the passage of the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement in 2010. The statute created a dedicated fund source targeted at maintaining and, to the extent possible, enhancing or maximizing recreational opportunity on the Columbia River main stem and tributaries. The statute also included a sunset clause of 2016, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. With regard to revenue and fisheries, the cost of the endorsement is $8.75, and again, it's required to fish the main stem and the tributaries of the Columbia River. That revenue, that $8.75, generates approximately $3.2 million each biennium, and that revenue is utilized by the department to meet our Endangered Species Act, or ESA, monitoring requirements for those fisheries. It's important to note that we have 13 listed species in the Columbia River, and our permits from the federal government require this monitoring. The fisheries that are most reliant on that funding occur and are prosecuted above McNary Dam. So because the original legislation included a sunset clause that ended in 2016, the department has been successful each year in getting the legislature to improve extensions of the law. And going into the 2019 legislative session, the endorsement was scheduled to sunset at the end of this fiscal year. Our original proposal in the 2019 session to the legislature sought to eliminate the sunset clause and make the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement permanent. This proposal was met with limited legislative support, so we revised the proposal to include a 4-year extension of the endorsement. And ultimately, the legislature did not approve this proposal, and as a result, the Columbia River salmon and steelhead endorsement expires at 11:59 p.m. on June 30th. As the director mentioned, the executive management team here at WDFW is struggling and wrestling with a number of significant challenges. This is just one of them. It is our intent to try to the extent possible, maintain those fisheries. It's going to be a significant challenge based on what the director said in his opening remarks. We're going to do our best. We know how important these fisheries are, primarily in the mid-Columbia and upper Columbia River. So you have our commitment to do our best to work through those issues. That's all I have. I'm going to pause there and introduce Eric Gardner, our Assistant Director for the Wildlife Program.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Eric Gardner. I'm the Assistant Director of the Wildlife Program. I'm going to encourage everybody to put down your fishing poles just for a minute or two and pick up your binoculars, because I'm going to talk a little bit about hunting and species recovery, so a little bit of change in pace. The Wildlife Program oversees quite a bit of work you may be interested in around the state, including management of our lands and our access sites. I'm not going to talk about those much today, but I hope I can in a future webinar. Tonight I'm going to focus primarily on hunting, hunter education, and then the species recovery component with a focus on wolves. So a couple things just real quick before I start with the wolf presentation is it's springtime, and it's a wonderful time to get outdoors, and it's a wonderful time to get outdoors and hunt turkey. And turkey season's open right now through the end of May. And I'm just encouraging everybody to get out and participate. And if you've already got your bird or your birds, maybe think about taking somebody new out and try to get some recruitment going on. And I'd encourage you to become familiar with some of the different programs that we have in the state. And I'm going to hold up the wild turkey brochure, which you can get at your licensed dealer or online in a PDF. But on the back, there's information about our first turkey program. So for that new hunter you take out, maybe that's something you can participate in. And then below that's the Washington Slam. So if you're a long-time successful hunter, maybe the Slam is something you'd be interested in. I also wanted to point out another brochure that's important to everybody right now in the hunting world. It's the Big Game Season brochure. And just kind of a call out and a reminder that the deadline for special permit applications is coming up fast. It's May 22nd at midnight, so if you're interested in any of the special permit applications, now's the time. Don't miss your opportunity. Our theme this year was Field to Feast, and so we're really trying to maybe appeal to folks who haven't always hunted and remind them that hunting provides a sustainable, healthy food source. And so if you look at our brochure, not only do you see on the cover a family participating in hunting, but a recipe they submitted, as well as several other recipes further back in the brochure. And I hope you have the opportunity to look through those. A couple other real quick points on the hunting side. We had some legislation this year titled Concerning Visible Clothing Requirements for Hunting, but it's more commonly known as Hunter Pink. And so we did have a law passed where we're going to be able to have Hunter Pink as an option in addition to the Hunter Orange that everybody's familiar with. Because of the timing of that legislation, you won't see information in our brochure about Hunter Pink, but we will be taking a rule change in September to our commission meeting there. And assuming that passes, we'll have our new wax in place through that process. But prior to that, we'll have an emergency rule setting so that we can have the gap kind of bridged with Hunter Pink allowance. So I just encourage people to Look for that information, or if you're interested in a new color while you're out in the field this year. One other quick hunting topic, we are currently accepting comments on our fall black bear hunting seasons and regulations. And we've proposed some rulemaking back in April 23rd. Our recommendations are to adjust season dates to open August 1 statewide and changing our bag limit to 2 bears per license statewide. And we have a couple of game management units that we would remove from that just to a lack of presence of resident bears. But you can look online and on our hunting page on the WDFW hunting main page, scroll down and look at hunting news and updates, and you'll see a big picture of a black bear, and you can go there to find out how to provide comment on our black bear hunting seasons. So with that, I think I will move into the next topic, and I'll be on my wolf presentation in just a second, but wolf presentation is going to include conversations about a periodic status review. And so I just wanted to point out that there are always, or typically there are several periodic status reviews underway. And right now, if you go to our website, you can look and provide comment on some of those. For tufted puffin, which also includes a recovery plan. So we're really interested in hearing public input on the tufted puffin and recovery plan document, as well as grizzly bear and Oregon spotted or silver spot butterfly. And I believe pinto abalone is up there as well on the fish program side. So I'd encourage you to look at our species recovery conservation pages and look for opportunities to provide input to the department on all of those topics. And with that, I'll get quickly into a wolf presentation, which will reference back to a periodic status review here in just a minute. Okay, so first, I'm just going to start with some basics about wolves, but they're highly adaptable and live in a variety of habitats, but they actually occupy quite a bit of space. So a pack in Washington, a pack typically is 4 animals. That's our average size, but they can range from 2 to 15. But a pack can take up about 300 square miles of habitat. Right now is sort of the birthing season. So breeding season was a little bit earlier in the year, February and March. And because of the length of the gestation period, we start to see pups being born in April and May. So right now, our pups are hitting the ground, and our wolf numbers are going up, as that happens every year with new litters. At the bottom of the slide here, you can see some information. We're starting to glean some information from an ongoing predator-prey study. While it's true that ungulates are the primary food source for wolves, so ungulates being white-tailed deer and mule deer, primarily here in Washington as the food source, but it would also include elk and moose. So while that's true, that the majority of their diet consists of ungulates, they also consume many other things. They're opportunistics, and they'll eat turkeys, beaver, and even small mammals. So a little bit about why we have wolves here in Washington. The slide in front of you now is really the northern Rocky mountain gray wolf population, and if you look down from Wyoming through Montana and Idaho, you can see quite a lot of information on wolf packs, and those wolf packs have fed their way into Washington. And so in the eastern 1/3 of our state is where we've seen the majority of the recolonization of wolves occur. It's also important to note that this northern Rocky Mountain population was federally delisted, and so when you look at the slide, pretty much everything that's there in Washington, except for the one on the far west side there, exists in that federally delisted portion of the state. The rest of the state is federally listed as endangered, and the entire state is listed as state endangered. So that movement from Canada and the neighboring states has pushed wolves into Washington. Important to note that we've never reintroduced wolves into the state. They've come here on their own through that migration and through the population expansion you saw on the previous slide. As they've entered into Washington, they've established several packs, and the map you see in front of you now is the distribution of those packs across the state. And as I mentioned earlier, eastern Washington is where the majority of those packs reside. And you can see that northeast Washington has a disproportionate amount of packs compared to the rest of the state. So when wolves showed up in Washington, I believe back in about 2008, documented our first wolves and our first wolf pack. The department set about developing a wolf management and recovery plan, and the slide here talks about some of the objectives of that plan. First is to restore self-sustaining wolf populations. Next is to maintain healthy ungulate populations. Next is to manage wolf and livestock conflict. And the final objective is to develop a public understanding and promote coexistence for wolves on the landscape. So I'm going to talk real quick about some numbers. We talked about the packs forming and moving into Washington. So there's 27 packs in Washington. 22 of those are in the Eastern Washington Recovery Zone. They're in yellow, and 5 are in the North Cascades Recovery Zone, and 0 are in, or none are in the South Cascades Recovery Zone. And I'm going to talk about those recovery zones in just a minute. And those packs represent 120. Oh no, I'm going to draw a blank. 127 animals in the state. With the wolf recovery plan, which I'm going to talk about more here in just a minute, we focus on breeding pairs. So even though I've talked quite a bit about packs in the past, breeding pairs are the way we measure productivity and progress through the recovery plan. So this slide shows that in the Eastern Washington Recovery Zone we have 12 breeding pairs, and in the North Cascades there are 3, and we still do not have any in the other recovery zone. So talking a little bit about recovery, we're doing pretty well with wolves. We've had a steady increase since 2008, approximately 20-some percent annual increase on average. But to get to recovery, our recovery plan talks about a few different ways to get there. One is to have 15 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years, or 18 successful breeding pairs in 1 year, essentially, with 4 of those breeding pairs in each of the recovery zones and 6 sort of floaters anywhere in the state. The way things are going as wolf recovery progresses in the state, we're more likely to get to that 18 successful breeding pairs trigger before we would get to the 15. Here's sort of a breakdown of that. Eastern Washington, by the recovery plan, we should have 4 breeding pairs. We have 12, so we're well above that. In the North Cascades, we should have, we're shooting for 4. We have 3. And in the Southern Cascades, as I've mentioned, we've yet to establish a pack or a breeding pair. So what that comes to is we're doing fairly well with our wolf recovery, and we're making progress through our wolf recovery plan, but it's also time to take a fresh look at the status of wolves in the state, and not only that, but to begin planning for future management of wolves in the state. So I've talked about periodic status reviews a little bit ago with tufted puffin and some other species. Just wanted to point out that we've embarked on a periodic status review for wolves, and we're encouraging public participation in that process. And that'll go through the normal PSR, periodic status review process. If for some reason that periodic status review results in a recommended change in status in the wolves from endangered to any other status, it would involve an additional public process to meet our SEPA bar, ensure additional public participation. So we are conducting the status review with a draft expected by late summer of 2019. And in that review, we will not only be looking at wolf numbers as they compare to the wolf recovery plan, but we'll also be looking very specifically at Washington's administrative code language that describes how and when to list and delist species. And hopefully you can see the smaller print on this slide talks about the things we will look at as we actually look at a new refreshed look at the status of wolves around the state. We'll update our webpage, the same webpage where you can find the tufted puffin and other species recovery plans now. We'll update that with the draft when it's available. And as I mentioned before, if a listing status is recommended as a result of all of that, there would be a further public engagement process in the fall of 2019. One final point is that long-term conservation and of wolves we need to start thinking about that and planning for it. So we'll at some time in the near future be moving beyond our recovery plan into a wolf management plan. And so we are working internally to figure the timeline and steps and process for that. And we will be developing a new wolf plan. And you can expect to hear from the department about that process later this fall, and we'll have several public scoping meetings and provide opportunity to provide input and comment on a post-delisting management plan for wolves here in the coming year, and we look forward to engaging the public on that. And for more information on wolves, here's a link to a website for you, and I encourage you to go there. And if you're interested in receiving email notifications or updates on wolf activities, there's another link for you to grab as well, and we hope to share as much information on wolves as we can, and also to hear from all of you about our management. I believe that wraps it up for me, so thank you for your time, and if you have questions, I'll get to them later, but for now, I'm going to turn the mic over to Tim Burns, our Capital Asset Management Program Assistant Director.
Thank you, Eric. Good evening. Again, I'm Tim Burns, the Assistant Director for the Capital and Asset Management Program, and we are the agency's engineering, construction, and maintenance arm. I'm happy to report tonight that we received a very favorable capital budget for the next biennium. This budget will reduce risk to native salmon and steelhead by funding projects that will help production of Endangered Species Act listed fish, improve water quality standards of discharged water, and increase prey abundance in support of southern resident killer whales. Additionally, the projects will ensure our facilities are safe for our staff, support the public's enjoyment of natural resources, and recapitalize our unique facilities and infrastructure assets. As I mentioned earlier, our capital budget was very favorable, and we received consists of $111 million for the next biennium. We received $53 million of new appropriations. 65% of the funding is for hatchery-related projects. In addition, we have $58 million of reappropriated funding. The reappropriated funds are monies that we currently have for our over 150-plus active projects that will continue into the next biennium. Again, much of the funding is associated with hatchery projects. Now I'd like to provide a quick overview of the major projects to be funded in the next biennium. We received $11.8 million for the Wallace River Hatchery to begin construction of the Phase 1 of this project, and that consists of demolition of rearing ponds, constructing new sediment ponds, new rearing ponds, and pollution abatement system, and renovate the Wallace River intake. We received $1.7 million to complete the third and final phase of the Suze Creek hatchery renovation. This project completely replaces the existing hatchery by constructing a new hatchery outside of the floodplain. The new facilities will meet all federal and state criteria for fish screening, fish passage, and water quality standards. We received $2.3 million of additional funding to replace the existing upper gravity intake and the lower pumped intake with a single gravity intake structure at the Minter Creek hatchery. In addition, we received $2 million for forest health, which will reduce fire risk through prescribed burning and forest thinning actions on thousands of acres of Fish and Wildlife owned forest land in eastern Washington. Work will include burn unit layout, conducting forest thinning and pre-burn fuel treatment projects, conducting fuel assessments, and implementing burns to meet restoration and resource objectives. The Army Corps of Engineers is planning to increase the height of the sediment control structure on the Toutle River, which is downstream of Mount St. Helens. The project includes the renovation of the state-operated fish collection facility. The Corps and the state have negotiated an agreement for the project, resulting in 83% cost share for the Corps and 17% for the state. The $6.8 million will be used for the design of the new facility as well as land acquisition to provide wildlife habitat as mitigation for this project. The $7.7 million received for the Samish hatchery will rebuild the intake and fishway in the Samish River to meet fish passage and fish screening standards. We received $4.8 million to construct a new main intake for the Dungeness hatchery. This project will provide a new compliant intake structure on Fish and Wildlife property, provide a more efficient water source for both the hatchery and the Agnew Irrigation District, as well as improved worker safety for operations and maintenance activities. We received $3.1 million to complete the third and final phase of this project by removing the old siphon intake in Weir. The Forks Creek project replaces two old non-compliant intake structures, removes fish passage barriers within the creek, and opens up an additional 28 miles of spawning habitat for salmon. The Wootton Wildlife Area Floodplain Improvements Project is a multi-biennial project to address the deteriorating conditions of the Tucannon Lakes and other infrastructure while enriching recreational uses. The money for the next biennium will allow us to design and construct Deer Lake and possibly begin the design for the Beaver Watson Lake. And we recently completed the construction of the new Rainbow Lake and dam structure. The Snow Creek Resort Site is a very popular access site on Nia Bay, and it's used for fishing, wildlife viewing, and boating. The facility consisted of an old rail launch system, a deteriorated steel pier, a floating dock, and camping facilities. The site was closed in 2018 due to unsafe and failing facilities and infrastructure. We received $143,000 to conduct a pre-design study as a first step towards renovating these facilities. We received monies to continue our successful cooperative fencing and cost-sharing program with landowners who experience chronic crop damage caused by deer and elk. We typically use $300,000 to implement a cooperative fencing program with private landowners, and $900,000 is used to replace elk fencing on our own properties in our wildlife areas. The last of our major projects, we received $150,000 to complete a pre-design study to provide secure storage in a parking compound at our Spokane Regional Headquarters. This is the final phase of the new headquarters facility that has not been previously funded. The headquarters is located in a business park with very restrictive covenants that restrict overnight uncovered parking and storage of equipment. Currently, vehicles and equipment are stored and parked at an off-site leased facilities, and this impacts employee productivity and efficiency. Our budget includes $10.5 million for minor works projects. These are projects that are typically less than $1 million. We have funding for 19 minor works projects that can be categorized as shown on this slide. Some of these categories consist of a number of smaller sub-projects. In addition to our capital budget, we received funding through the Recreation Conservation Office's Boating Facilities Program. Funding for these projects come from a portion of the gasoline tax paid by boaters. $6.3 million was provided for improvements to 10 boating access sites on Fish and Wildlife lands. This concludes my presentation. Next up, I'd like to introduce our Chief of Enforcement, Chief Steve Baer, who will address enforcement priorities for the next biennium.
Thank you, Tim, and good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Baer. I'm proud to be here tonight as Chief of the Enforcement Program, representing the hardworking men and women of the Fish and Wildlife Police. We're focused on the protection of Washington's fish and wildlife. We interact with all the other programs in the department. Our priority is enforcing the regulations that protect the wildlife, through closures or opportunities that are provided for sustainable harvest, and enforcing the methods and means that that's allowed under. And we always have an emphasis on protection of the threatened and endangered stocks. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the things that we're working on right now. We've spent a lot of time on our recruiting. We've got some emphasis patrols that we've been working on. I'm going to talk a little bit about some new Orca regulations that were just recently passed by the governor. Recruitment's been a high priority for us. We've been carrying a lot of vacancies, and like all law enforcement agencies, we've been working hard to try and fill those. In the last biennium, we've hired 22 new officers. That takes a lot of time away from officers who might otherwise be out there enforcing regulations, where they're spent training new officers, trying to teach them the nuances of resource law enforcement. 22 is a big hurdle for us. We hired 4 the first year of the biennium and 18 the last year, so we're still in the process of training a lot of those officers. Right now we have 141 positions filled, and we're carrying 2 vacant officer positions. Doesn't leave us a lot of options for folks that we're going to be hiring in the coming year, but I know that we've possibly picked up a couple additional officers, and we lost 2 under the Columbia River Salmon and Steelhead endorsement, so I think it's going to be about a break even for us in this coming biennium. We also started an apprenticeship program. We hope to continue that. It wasn't funded, so we're going to have to evaluate that in the coming year to see if we do have the money that can support that through our vacancy rate, if we're not able to fill the remaining 2 positions, or if we pick up any more through retirements. But we thought that was a good way to introduce young people to our program, show them some of the things that we do while they're still trying to decide maybe where their career is going to take them. It also introduces them to other career fields within our department. Some of the patrols we've been working on lately, we just kicked off the boating season. We had a lot of incidents that first couple weeks. We were involved in everything from people striking rocks and needing rescue to medical emergencies out on the water. A lot of times we'll work with our sister law enforcement agencies and the Coast Guard to try and provide an immediate response to try and save people. One of the other things we've seen during our general law enforcement checks is that a lot of people weren't prepared. I think maybe the good weather, they might have rushed things a little bit and maybe didn't go through their boats as well as they should have, didn't have all their safety gear that they should have. So good reminder, you never know how what you hope would be a good day of boating could turn into a tragedy if you're not prepared for it. So, check and make sure you've got all your devices, some way to notify other boaters if there's an emergency. You've got all your flotation devices for everybody that's on board and things like that. So we're seeing a lot more of that than we probably should have at the beginning of this year. Our dangerous wildlife calls have increased a lot lately. We're spending a lot of time dealing with cougar incidents, and our bear activity in the last week, it went from 34 to last week 103 calls. So the bear activity has really increased a lot. So we would hope that people would be aware that those animals are out there. We live in an area of the country where we know there's dangerous wildlife, so always be thinking that they could be out there, and take all those precautions necessary to live there. If you know that there's been an incident in your area, maybe think about, do I have any attractants out that I might want to put away, knowing that there's wildlife out in my area. So try and monitor that. A lot of neighborhoods now have Facebook pages that talk specifically about things like that. Where if your neighbors mention to you that they saw a bear, maybe ask. You can always call someone in the department here. We have lots of good information on things you can do to interact with the wildlife who live here and share our state with us. everybody knows that we do the typical wildlife patrols, the fish and wildlife. We've been doing a lot of the fishing patrols right now just because of the time of year. We had a lot of cases this last week for people fishing without a license. So if you think you're going to be fishing, now's a good time to go buy that license. We saw a lot of over limits, people over limiting fish, shrimp, clams. We even had someone out poaching crab already, and some pot violation years. One of the things you might not realize that we do a lot of is the wildlife trafficking as well. We had 2 positions that were funded after I-1401 was passed in 2015. Our officers and detectives have been doing a lot of work on that, looking at marketplaces for people who are violating that law. And we recently participated in the Toss the Tusk event at the Woodland Park Zoo along with the Attorney General's office, where they announced that they were going to prosecute the first 2 cases in the state that involved wildlife trafficking. So we've been spending a significant amount of time working on that as well, which is outside of our normal, what we would consider our fish and wildlife patrols. The legislature passed and the governor just signed into law the new law concerning Orca vessels. This increases the distance that a vessel or other objects may not approach, and it also established speed limits within a half mile of orcas. We'll be spending a lot of time this summer trying to educate the public on these changes. Right now, our law is a little bit different than Canada's. We require the 300 yards from all directions, 400 front or back. And Canada law is a little bit different, so we may have to educate some Canadian boaters when they come down. There's talk that the Canadians are going to change theirs as well, but that hasn't happened yet. But we'll be working with all the other law enforcement agencies to try and educate the public this year on those new changes as well. So those are the only changes that I wanted to talk about tonight. It's my first time doing this. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Chief, and thanks to all the panel members for presenting an update. So we're going to shift now to the Q&A portion of our digital open house. And if you've just logged in and you've submitted a question, we've got about 20 so far in the queue. So we'll start marching through those. But also, if you haven't submitted a question yet, go ahead and click on the chat icon. A box will open up where you just submit your name and your email address, and then it'll open up a text box where you can submit your message to us. So we'll do our best to answer the questions, and if needed, we might need to ask you to submit a question to our director at dfw.wa.gov account, and we will follow up and get you that information if we're not able to answer it this evening. So the first handful of questions that have come in to me are regarding wolves. And first one here, Director, I'll turn it to you, which is, how do we confirm wolf numbers?
Thanks, Nate. There are a number of ways we confirm wolf numbers. We do it annually. We typically do it around the January timeframe, beginning January timeframe, the winter time. It's a time when there's typically snow on the ground so that we can better spot the wolves and also use tracks. We do a combination of aerial surveys. We have radio collars on many of the wolves. That gets us in the right area. We can go to areas of reported wolves. We also do ground surveys, including trail cams to identify specific wolves, and then we can also just go out to reported areas and base it on tracks, particularly in the snow time of the year. We also work with our partners, meaning other entities, government entities, and tribes to come up with a number of wolves in the state. We do that annually. We do it at the low point of the year. It's a time of before the pups are born and after whatever mortalities we've had the previous year takes place. So it's intentionally a low number. That's the number that Eric reported earlier. This year was 127 wolves.
And a correction, if I may, 126. I misspoke.
Okay. Okay. I had 127 in my head too, so we were both wrong.
Great. Will, Eric, this is another question on wolves, and the viewer asked, what peer-reviewed science can we cite that supports the removal of wolves after there's been depredations?
Peer review science. You know, I don't know that I could quote papers. We certainly have wolf expert biologists that present that, and we go through a process every year when we report on our annual wolf report to the commission, and during that they give an annual update of the science that's been reviewed to work with, that's pertinent to current management, and the question in particular is part of that science. But I'm sorry, I don't have a name for you of a particular article. I'll see if I can find that. Sorry.
Sounds good. And I think that, you know, some of the work that Bradley's done in Montana is certainly one author, and another body of work is actually work that our staff did along with some scientists from Washington State University that modeled the wolf population in recovery in response to management actions following depredations. And we saw that doing some removals would not harm the overall recovery of wolves. So I'd refer the viewer to Appendix G and H of our Wolf Conservation and Management Plan for some further information, as well as there'll be a list of citations of other science that supports some management actions following depredations that will not harm recovery, but also address conflict when it's got to that stage. Eric, or why don't we start with Eric? How do we, let's see here, how do we know how many wolves are harvested by the Colville tribe?
Well, we work with the tribes to discuss wildlife conservation management across the state on a regular basis, and our Region 1 office and staff work with the tribes and meet with them regularly, and they tell us about their management programs and their harvest numbers every year. So.
Thanks, Eric. This next question, we've got two Kellys on board, so I'm going to send this one to the director. Matt asks, what's going to happen to the Columbia River now that the Columbia River salmon steelhead endorsement has not been extended as of June 30th it expires? So what will happen with those fisheries?
We're in the process of figuring that out right now. This is an area where, in discussions with the legislature, they backfilled our budget hole for the first year as best they could, assuming that the endorsement fee or price would be extended, meaning that we're short. So we have to make cuts. We don't have the money to fully fund the positions and the activities supported by that endorsement now. That said, we're trying to figure out where we can adjust our budget and what we can do. So I don't have an answer for you right now. I think we'll be finalizing our plan going ahead, getting confirmation with our commission on that, and we'll have an answer later this month.
Thanks, Director. Shifting gears here to cougars, I'll start with Kelly Susewind. Dale asks, what could the Department of Fish and Wildlife do to open a hound cougar pilot program on the east side of the state? And so maybe before jumping to the hound side, maybe talk about the new bill that passed.
Yeah, the question talks about a hound cougar pilot program, so that doesn't define what that really is. I'm going to start with the hunting side. So right now we cannot hunt cougars with hounds other than for dangerous animal removal conducted by the state, and we would need state legislation in order to change that. That said, the state legislature this year passed a bill to allow a training activity, a pursuit season, so that in those cases where we need a houndsman to come in and remove dangerous animals, we have houndsmen that are prepared, tuned up, and their hounds are fit. So that, if that's what's meant by a pilot program, we're starting rulemaking on that soon, but it will be only to pursue animals in order to keep hounds fit.
Great. Let's jump over to fishing now. Bill asks, each year, really over the past 3 years, he feels that is lost opportunity for fishing. And Bill asks, how are we supporting the sport angler?
So as you saw from Kyle's, I'll speak to salmon first. As you saw from Kyle's report, we're trying to maximize opportunity within the constraints we have. That's going to require a number of things. One is the work that Jeff talked about, getting some higher numbers of returns. We can safely take a higher percentage of a higher number of fish. You can actually increase opportunity a significant amount if we can get those returns back up. Beyond that, we are looking at ways to increase production, increase the survival. That was the flex bill that you heard about, and also increase our returns. It's an uphill battle, but as Jeff said, I think we can get there. I think it's important to note that this is an area I want to be direct with folks. I know there's a ton of frustration around lack of opportunity. At the same time, we ask for a fee increase. I just ask folks to think through the situation. In these times of incredible constraints, declining runs, it costs more to actually provide the opportunity. With declining opportunity, the effort it takes to provide what opportunity is available is more. You all can make your own choice of whether it's a good investment in fees or not, but those fees are what are going to allow us to continue to manage, allow us to hopefully turn around this run return, and allow us to provide you with more opportunity. That's what we're trying to do. Time will tell if we're successful.
Thanks, Kelly. And Kelly Cunningham, do you want to round out some other activities we're doing outside of salmon?
Yeah, I think, sorry, let me get the mic in front. There's a lot of opportunity in the state outside of salmon. Our warm water fisheries in the state of Washington are amazing. Our trout fisheries are amazing. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And a lot of people are focused on the salmon and steelhead pieces where, as Jeff and the director and Kyle have mentioned, we have those challenges. On the bright side this year, as Kyle mentioned, we're looking at pretty good coho returns, so we're hoping for more opportunity associated with those increased coho returns.
So this question is coming to us from Carol, and she asks, can you speak to the idea of a conservation license as a way to support management with conservation aims or outcomes?
So a conservation license is something, so when I talked earlier about the homework we did getting ready for this legislative session, part of that was through a budget and policy advisory group. One of the things that we considered with them were conservation licenses. And frankly, there's room for that. I don't think it's a golden answer. It's not the silver bullet, so to speak. The returns were not particularly high, and I think we need, frankly, a more durable opportunity or investment. That said, part of the investment we needs to come from the broader community, not just hunters and fishers. That's why we went for a big chunk of general fund, and a conservation license might be one way to get there. It's not been precluded, but it just wasn't seen as the best venue at this point in time. That said, we were not successful in what we thought was the best venue, so it might be time to rethink. And Nate led Nate, you led the BPAG. This is your expertise.
Well, and we did look at a number of different ways to fund the department. Really, we had two main principles that we tried to apply. The work of the department is so broad that we really wanted to try to have our primary fund source be a broad-based funding source, and that we would use user fees to supplement and augment those opportunities, in particular where it costs a little bit more to manage and provide that opportunity. We have so this year we ended up pursuing about 3/4 of our budget requests through the state general fund and 1/4 through a modest recreational license fee increase. We're interested in continuing to explore what those other options are. We're looking at what other states are doing for unique funding sources. And really a potential game changer is occurring with legislation at the federal level. And that's through a bill that's titled Recovering America's Wildlife Act, where it would take federal funds and dedicate to fish and wildlife conservation and essentially fund each state's wildlife action plan. So this would be the third leg of the stool to complement the excise taxes on firearms and ammunition for for hunting and wildlife conservation through Pittman-Robertson, and Dingle-Johnson on the excise tax on fishing tackle. So this would be a significant infusion of funding for conservation. And for Washington, it's almost $30 million a year. So it would be a game changer for us to be able to invest new money into areas that really do need a lot of support. So, let's see here. This next question, I'll turn it to the director, and then Kyle, you might need to assist here, but that is, how are we ensuring that north of Falcon decisions are made in public and within the state of Washington?
So you heard Kyle mention earlier, or you had a slide showing the number of public meetings that lead up to and include north of Falcon. We've also added the live streaming opportunity while we're in those processes. While we're at north of Falcon, we have daily meetings with our advisory groups, which are made up of folks that want to help us get through this, so members of the public. That said, the decisions are made in a number of venues, and we have to be at the table with the tribes to make a final decision on what we will present and move forward. And that is done in a meeting with the tribes. We do our best to provide public input before that, to provide transparency while that's going on, and to incorporate the needs of the broadest public we can in making those decisions. As far as within Washington, I can assure you they're made by the state of Washington. The decisions might be made in California because that's where the Pacific Council meets, and that's where the final approvals will come from. So where the decisions are made, I can't speak to that always being in Washington, but it's always by those of us in Washington representing Washington State.
Kyle, anything you want to add?
I might just add, yes, the fishery, Pacific Fishery Management Councils move around, and that's because that council isn't just talking about Washington fisheries, they're talking about fisheries from Washington to California and the Mexican border. So the way the schedule lines up, we do have years where we're making the final decisions in California. While we're doing that, we have daily conference calls with advisors and interested public back in Washington to update them on the status of negotiations, on the decisions we're making. So we do as much as we can to make sure that people back home understand what's going on as we make those decisions.
Dale asks, how can we ask for more license fees when we are losing opportunity?
Well, again, I'm going to suggest that license fees or stable funding for the agency, whether it be license fees, general fund, or some other fund source, is what it's going to take to improve opportunity, to increase opportunity. The idea that it doesn't increase cost over time is really not in line with reality. I don't think our last fee increase was in 2011. If we stick with the budget package we have right now, we'll have gone 10 years without an increase. Costs have certainly increased in that time. Pressure has increased in that time. And again, as we have a growing population and a fixed land base, even if we're good at managing those species, the cost of providing that management will go up in time. And I think the best way to make sure that we do our job to deliver the opportunities, to make sure that we have a budget that supports a sustainable workforce for us to do that.
Okay, we've got a couple pretty kind of technical questions here on salmon management. So the first question is from Bill, who asks, if the Chehalis River Spring Chinook run is in such bad shape, has the Chehalis tribe stopped their fishing?
We've just recently come to an agreement that we're closing fishing in the Chehalis for Spring Chinook. The Chehalis tribe will be allowed one ceremonial Chinook this year.
The Chehalis tribe has closed their fishery with that reserved ability to take one ceremonial fish during the season.
Thanks. And then Dane asks, does the department have any plans to challenge the assumption that mid-Hood Canal Chinook represent a distinct population?
I'll take a shot at this one, and then I'm going to turn to our expert. I don't think we have a plan to challenge the assumption that was made by a technical review group a couple decades ago. I think our focus is going to be making sure that we're looking at the right population, that we have a successful run there that can actually meet the objectives. So are we committed to taking that on and turning it around with a better directed, more meaningful approach to getting the numbers? Yes. Are we going to challenge the basic assumption that it's a distinct population? I don't think that's a really viable option and not a good investment in our time. That's my take from my view, but Kyle, Kelly, we have a couple experts here.
Well, I think as we look at some of the options you mentioned, part of that will be trying to review the historic information and understand what the population there looked like historically. Will that lead us down the road to talking with NOAA about, hey, was this the right designation? Should you have looked at something else? Is there new information? Possibly, but I think in the short term, the efforts will be the sort of things you outlined.
Let's see here. The next question is from Bill, who asks, are we considering any early retirements or staff cuts to fill our budget holes?
So we will address, we will consider all of our staffing needs to address budget holes. Not really in a position to offer early retirements without a state standard or state change in law. We're definitely be looking at potential staff cuts. We also can look at, as staff leave, not filling positions immediately. So that's the vacancy management you might have heard others talk about. We will consider all of that standard workforce management in an attempt to address, to balance the budget.
Okay, jumping back to north of Falcon, Chad asks, why can't we have open public meetings with all co-managers in the north of Falcon process?
One, I'll say, having been through one season of this and one season only, I think that would be pretty unwieldy. It's pretty difficult as it is. That said, that the tribes want to negotiate one-on-one with their co-manager being the state, and that puts the responsibility on us to make sure that our stakeholders and constituents are represented, but it doesn't allow us to bring them into that room.
I just add that the tribes are sovereign governments. They do not have to meet with us if they don't want to. They don't have to meet with members of our public if they don't want to. We've, over the years, tried to do things to provide more transparency. Historically, we had some observers in the room. That process has ended. The past 2 years, we've had sort of a plenary session with the tribes and the public to talk about some of the high-level fishery issues, some of the problems we face. But ultimately, if it's the tribe's decision. If they want to have a government-to-government meeting, then that's what we have. We went into a lot of detail on this a couple of years ago with the Fish and Wildlife Commission as the commission renewed their North of Falcon policy. Had a good presentation from the AG's office on the legalities of that and how it relates to our open public meeting process. So encourage people to go back and look at the January meeting from, I believe it was 2017. When we got that presentation from the AG's office explaining a lot of the legal basis for sovereign governments and government-to-government meetings.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Bill asks, why did the department allow gill nets back in the main stem of the Columbia River?
So that was a commission decision. The implementation of the Columbia River policy would have had us transitioning away from gill nets this year. That policy also had an adaptive management process built into it, assuming that we would make progress on meeting the goals and objectives of that policy, which include sustaining a commercial fishery on the river. We have not made the progress we needed to in finding alternative gears to replace gill nets, and the commission made a decision to extend the policy and allow gill nets to stay in the river for an additional period of time while we figure out how to implement the rest of the policy. That's a decision that was vetted publicly. They somewhat, I know there's dissatisfaction with the process because of the timing and the location of the decision, but that's the decision as I understand it. I got again, two experts. I keep answering these questions and knowing that these guys know more than I do, so I'm going to look over there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are a number of provisions in the policy that, once implemented, result in the removal of gill nets off the main stem. You mentioned the alternative gear piece, Director Susewind. The other thing is that there are a couple of components that support that as well. One of them is development of safe areas. In Washington, we're geographically challenged with safe areas. That would be a place where gill nets could be allowed, off-channel fisheries. We've had challenges associated with getting hatchery fish to return to that area. And then when the hatchery fish that do return there, there's wild fish present, so it kind of defeats the purpose. So that's been a significant challenge for us. Additionally, there's a buyback provision, a gill net buyback provision in the policy that has been a significant challenge for the department to implement a buyback program absent having funding to do so. So I think you're absolutely right, Director Susewind. Based on our challenges in getting those key elements across the finish line, the commission made the decision to delay full implementation of the policy.
Okay, let's jump back to wolf conservation. Chris asks, how can the department support federal wolf delisting when wolves are not recovered on the majority of their historic range? And they cited not recovered on 85% of their historic range. So, Kelly?
So we try to focus our efforts on Washington populations. We think Washington populations are doing well, and we have a standing position from our Fish and Wildlife Commission that we will like to return management of wolves in Washington state back to the state. We believe that delisting will do that, particularly within our state. I would look to Eric to speak more to the more broad population in states beyond Washington.
Yeah, thank you, Director. Yeah, I think my answer will mainly focus on Washington as well, but certainly recognizing that federal protection under the Endangered Species Act can be critically important for species recovery in certain circumstances and situations. When it comes to wolf management here in Washington, I think it's important to really, recognize that there really is no federal recovery plan or program underway to lead towards recovery in the state. So we're kind of faced with a future of permanent federal listing status unless something very significant were to happen. So the state, if we had full management authority, and we would be able to have consistent program across the state and be able to respond in similar situations and fashions and provide similar resources and non-lethal programs across the state in the same way that you see on the east side. And I think it would just provide for essentially a more robust program to get public acceptance around wolf presence on the landscape throughout the whole state of Washington. And wolf management is really about managing that kind of coexistence piece between wolves and humans on the landscape, and having the state split into 2/3 and 1/3, where we'd have very little ability to manage in part of the state. In contrast to the eastern portion is, I think, the main reason why we seek that consistency with the federal delisting would provide for that consistency statewide.
Let's see here, and kind of back to north of Falcon theme, what reductions in fishing areas, timing, and quotas did the tribes face? So I'm thinking, I'd interpret this of looking at the 2019 loaf and comparing that with the 2018 seasons. What were some of the changes that the tribes and reductions the tribes saw?
So that's a tough one to answer, partly because of the number of tribes involved and the wide range of fisheries. We focused a lot on the Stillaguamish River as being one of the big constraining stocks. To put it kind of in perspective, the final fishing plan allows the Stillaguamish tribe to have a ceremonial fishery for 15 Chinook in the Stillaguamish River, their home watershed, the only place they can fish. So it varies from place to place, tribe to tribe, what the final seasons look like. But on that most constraining stock, that's what the tribe in that watershed will be fishing for this year, is 15 ceremonial Chinook.
Okay. Thanks, Kyle. And next question is actually on the Stillaguamish, and maybe I'll ask Jeff to take a stab at this one. How are we working to buy land along critical habitat areas such as the Stillaguamish? And there's a parenthetical that says, if that were guaranteed, this individual could support a license fee increase.
Well, land acquisition is one tool that's important. Maybe looking across the state, land acquisition, maybe in eastern Washington where land values are much lower than in the Puget Sound Basin, we get more bang for our buck. That said, we work very diligently under the Growth Management and Shoreline Management Acts. So in my presentation, I had a land use category. There's state laws that say that local governments have to protect riparian management zones under their critical areas ordinance. So we work very diligently to make sure that in this particular case, Snohomish County and the cities within Snohomish County would have robust critical areas ordinances. So that's that protection layer. We also work with agriculture, conservation districts, land trusts to provide or to develop and implement incentive programs for landowners, particularly agriculture, to where they're taking land out of production, so they're losing a value. They can participate in an incentive program to plant and maintain functioning riparian zones for the protection of these river systems. And this still is a tough one. It doesn't have a ton of people in it, but there's a lot of restoration opportunity within the Stillaguamish. I know we are working with the tribes to do significant estuary restoration, and that has been a huge benefit to smolt productivity coming out of the Stillaguamish. One of our big challenges is fine sediment in the system and a really flashy river system. So the significant flooding and movement of sand and gravel in that basin, as well as some of the glacial deposits that we're working through that put fine silts in the spawning gravel. So a lot of effort. That is one of the basins where you'll see the habitat program use those tools that I walked through in the presentation to really focus even more time and energy working with the tribe and local governments and NGOs to address all the constraints on salmon production that we're seeing in that basin.
Okay, Wayne asks the question of how does the department plan to address bycatch and impacts to non-targeted species? So I'm not sure which fishery Wayne's thinking about, but maybe Kelly Cunningham or Kyle?
That is a pretty broad question without sort of a specific example. Like when we plan our salmon fishing seasons, we're accounting not just for the catch of Chinook and Chinook fisheries, but Chinook and all the other fisheries going on out there, be they net, sport, wherever they occur. So we're use our fishery models to not just account for the directed catch, but the catch that we know happens in fisheries targeting other species.
Anything you want to add on the commercial side of that, Kyle, or is that still
It's
fishery by fishery?
It's the same for sport and commercial. We're trying to account for all the impacts, whether they're a directed impact or a bycatch in another fishery.
Thanks. So Wayne, if there's a particular fishery that you want us to follow up with, send us an email at director@dfw.wa.gov, and we'll get you in touch with that information. So. Kyle asks, has the department ever discussed issuing tags for salmon and halibut instead of managing through daily bag limits?
It's a historic question. I'll give it to my historic brain trust.
We have. We haven't gone that route to date, but that is something we've considered as the number of harvestable fish has decreased over time. Is there another way to do it other than a license and a catch record card? Is there some sort of tag program? Not a direction we've gone, but something we have considered.
And to implement that, we'd likely need legislative authority probably to create that particular tag or endorsement. But
Right.
good. Let's see here. Let's turn to a hunting question. Mark asks, have we thought about bringing back a spring bear season? So we do have a spring special permit bear season, so I'm not sure if Mark's thinking about a spring general season, but maybe Eric, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I'll try, but we do have the spring permit season, right? And is that, I guess, could you reread the question for me? I'm not quite sure.
Mark asked, how about bringing back a spring bear season? So I'm assuming he's
Just
talking about a general season.
General season, yeah. You know, I don't know that that's something we're considering at the moment. We're, you know, more focused on like our current regulations that are open are for the statewide, you know, to change the fall season and the August one across the state and kind of get consistency there. Spring harvest is you know, a little bit more regulated, and just that general season would allow for a significant more harvest. So in our general bear season, I believe we harvest around 2,000 or so bears in that fall season. So opening up that spring season could have a substantial impact on the population. So yeah. Sorry.
Next question is, the individual asks, are we actively tracking and monitoring wolves spotted in the Duval area?
I believe the answer is yes. If we have the information on that location, then we do send our wolf biologists out and try to determine the physical presence and document the presence, and then if possible put a collar on the wolves. So we do follow up on all of that information, and I believe we've done that with the Duval sighting.
Okay. I don't
Is that, I'm looking for some of my support and back.
We have a collar that died there, and we're trying to replace it.
So we have a collar on that has died, and we're trying to replace it. Yeah. Yeah.
So the collar failed then.
Yeah, the collar failed.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Michelle asks, what is the cost per call when we send people out to investigate depredations on livestock?
I don't have an answer for that. We would have to research that and actually calculate the call. So when we get the depredation call, we are committed that part of the success of wolf recovery in Washington is going to be that coexistence that Eric talked about. So we're trying to be timely and responsive when we get those calls to get out there, investigate, make sure we know what's really going on. It can be one or a couple of people typically, and it varies by how remote the location is. So to come up with an average would be difficult, and then we'd have to calculate a cost for that. I don't have that number. I don't think we track that. We track it as a whole on an annual basis, but we don't track it as on an individual call basis.
The only thing I would add, and you really covered, is it's really just it's a staffing expense. So it's just the number of staff and the amount of time they spend on site. There's usually not additional costs incurred with that unless there's any type of lab test or investigative work that occurs after the fact, but that's generally limited or small. So it's really just the staffing time present doing the investigation.
So similar theme. Melissa also asks, how are we solving repeat problems with large predators without killing the predator? What if people don't follow our recommendations? Do we follow up with citations or fines? So maybe Eric on the wildlife conflict side, and then Chief, if you would follow up with the second question about do we issue citations or fines? So.
Yeah, thank you. So on the first half, we have a fairly robust wildlife conflict program where we have staff all around the state, and their purpose is to help address conflict with landowners and wildlife. And so we do follow up and provide tips and guidance on how to avoid unwanted interactions with wildlife and particular predators. I think the question was specific about repeat occurrence. So some of the things that we would attempt to work with somebody on is to think about what's attracting the predator to the location in the first place, and it's usually some type of a food source. So in the case of bears, it can be as simple as like a compost area with food and dump site sort of thing, and so we can have a big impact on reducing repeat visits by wildlife just by cleaning up that food source there. With, say, cougars or wolves, it can be quite a bit more complex because frequently the food source is not just something that can easily be cleaned up. It's livestock. It's how people have their animals on the landscape, either in open pastures and even in corralled settings. And there are things that can be done to prevent animals from feeling comfortable, and so that they choose not to come back. And we primarily work to try to give people tools so that they can sort of alienate the wildlife from that environment, so they don't feel welcome there and they don't return. So we have several tools like that on the large predator side that we can provide to landowners.
I think Eric answered that pretty well. I mean, typically we don't issue citations unless it's something like garbage or something that you wouldn't expect people to have in the normal course of living. If it's livestock, it's hard to tell people that they can't have livestock or other things that might attract animals like that. But typically for us to take an enforcement action on somebody, it'd have to be something more egregious, like an attractant like a garbage, where they're failing to do something that you'd expect any common person to do.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Chief. Was funding approved for the Deschutes River hatchery? Tim?
Thank you, Nate. No, there was no funding approved for the construction of the Pioneer Park hatchery. We currently have about $9.5 million to finish the design and work through some environmental issues. And we're also constructing a new facility out at Tumwater Falls, which is part of the Deschutes Watershed Center. So that's under construction with a scheduled completion of this fall.
Great. Thanks, Tim. We received another question about the department's position on federal delisting of wolves, which we've already kind of covered that. So I'm going to jump to a question from Todd. Todd asks, have you thought about over-the-counter spring bear tags? And then why are some game management units in eastern Washington only open until September 1? So why do we delay the August opener and just start on September 1 for some GMUs in eastern Washington?
I'm gonna, if I may, ask for. That's what's being proposed. Yeah.
Recommending changing all of it to August 1.
Right. So, okay. So that's the same question that's being asked. So that's the information I provided about the fall black bear season, and the proposal is to adjust that to the August 1 date.
Okay. And then what about the other question about, have we ever thought about that general seasons for spring bear tags? And
Yeah.
we kind of touched on that earlier, but anything else you want to?
And that's actually the one I was looking to them for. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Chris asks, what is the department doing to increase future opportunities with branch antler bulls?
I'm sorry, I was thinking about the last question. What is the department doing to increase opportunities for branch antler bulls?
Yeah.
So, we have our elk management plans around the state, and we shoot for not only population numbers, but we look at the bull and cow ratio. So when we have an interest in increasing branch antler bull numbers, you might see us reduce bull harvest opportunities in general. And then we also have like the true spike rule, which is in place to allow for escapement of animals. So the purpose there is to ensure that a certain number of bulls survive that first year season, and they grow to an older age class where they can then produce that branch antlered bull and become available to harvest.
And Jeff, do you want to talk about anything the Habitat program's doing regarding big game?
Sure. I'll talk maybe a little bit more about what the department's doing on the habitat front for big game. So first and foremost, the habitat program reviews the elk management plans and deer management plans, and we look through our habitat lens and figure out what additional work we could be doing to support the agency in the management plan objectives. We work a lot on the federal forest lands in their land planning piece. Also, the department's doing a ton of, we call it forest health treatment, but that definitely will have benefits to ungulate populations or game populations specifically. So we're working on the private industrial forest lands, small forest lands, state forest lands, as well as the federal forest lands, to make sure that we're looking through that lens of general wildlife conservation, but also game species opportunities.
Bill asks, how is House Bill 2097 going to impact management of wolves? And do mitigation measures include lethal removal?
So House Bill 2097 really directs the department to focus on the periodic status review for wolves, and so that'll be one of the primary pieces there. And then also asks us to look at how we look at our protocol for removal when we get to that step in wolf management, and look at that in kind of a regional basis. Could you repeat the question about mitigation?
Do mitigation measures include lethal removal?
Under the bill, well, so we always have lethal removal as a tool, at least on the eastern third of the state, if we've been unable to address chronic depredation problems. So on the eastern 1/3 of the state, yes, it could go there, and on the eastern 2/3 of the state, because of the federal listing, it would not.
Okay, Dennis asks, I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit. He says, I heard a lot about salmon. What's the department doing to increase steelhead?
So a lot of challenges in Puget Sound with regard to steelhead. Speaking specifically about Puget Sound steelhead, we have a biological opinion associated with those fisheries and that production that is at risk as a result of our budget situation. That work is essential to ensuring that not only do we continue to allow those fisheries, but that we're sufficiently monitoring for the recovery of wild fish. Out on the coast, we're doing a lot of work out on the north coast to ensure that we don't get into a listing situation. But again, steelhead are cyclical. There's up years and down years, and we seem to see that those coastal populations seem to mimic the inland populations as well. In the Columbia River, big challenges with bee-run steelhead. We try to ensure that we're adequately monitoring those fisheries to ensure that we're getting enough escapement, or as much escapement as we possibly can, up into those tributaries. Again, the Columbia River endorsement is key to helping us monitor those fisheries. So again, a lot of challenges, not only on the biological front with steelhead, but also on the financial front. I don't know, Kyle, if there's anything you want to add.
Jeff, you want to add?
Yeah, I'd love to. Fish passage barrier corrections, one that's like a huge benefit to steelhead, and it doesn't matter where they are in the state. Some of our own research is showing that it's not always necessarily how many adults we have returning back, but how much access they have as adults and for the juveniles. So big work on in-stream flows, because we need enough water for these critters. Lots of riparian restoration and protection. There's floodplain restoration activities like side channels that are really critical to juvenile steelhead, and in some cases, depending on the river system, spawning. On the major or hydro projects piece, I'm thinking of the Yakima, pretty extensive work to try to improve juvenile downstream passage in the Yakima and the Columbia system. So lots of really important work going on the passage and the habitat protection and restoration side that will maybe benefit Chinook, but also is maybe targeting coho and steelhead.
So Andrew asks, how viable is a broodstock program on a watershed with impacted wild Chinook stocks, such as the Stiligwamish or the Snoqualmie?
So there are hatchery recovery programs going on in a lot of watersheds. I don't know the word broodstock. We do have some areas where there's a captive brood program where fish are being taken into the hatchery for their entire life cycle. But those are, in a lot of watersheds, our only option, and all that has fish returning to those watersheds right now are those hatchery recovery programs that are trying to keep the abundance up enough that when the habitat starts to recover, we'll have fish to use that habitat.
So this next question is from John, who asks, does the director see the gill nets on the Columbia River as a problem for recovering listed salmon?
So I think we're held to managing all the fisheries on the river in order to recover salmon. So the conservation goals are established through work between us and NOAA Fisheries on what's allowable on the river, what's required for escapement to support recovery, and then we're responsible for putting together a fisheries program that meets that. We've talked earlier about the Columbia River policy is intended to transition away from gill nets. I think the focus needs to be really on what are we catching, where and when, rather than the technique. And if those fish, last year we had 4 days of gill net fishing in the main stem Columbia, we wouldn't allow that if it jeopardizes our recovery goals. So I know it's a hot button item. I think the burden is on us to manage it in a way where it doesn't prohibit or impose a retardant on getting to our recovery goals. And that's established through our negotiations with NOAA.
Let's see here. We've got about probably a half a dozen more questions in the queue at this stage, but let's see here. The next viewer is Nick, who asks, what is the department's plan to recover mule deer and elk populations that have suffered significant population declines from his perspective?
Well, that's a fairly broad question. I would assume perhaps that there's a predator component mixed in with that question. And so we do have guidelines and processes in place where we can look at increasing predator management programs or control if we fall below certain guidelines for both of those species, right? And so as our department goes into our 3-year season setting, we frequently look at, or we will look at, the status of our mule deer and our elk herds across the state and see if we've met any of those triggers, which is generally a 25% reduction in harvest over 3 years for deer, and consider if we would do any predator, control programs around that. I would think that was the genesis of the question, but.
So Nick, if you have some more details that you are wanting to get at, if you would please send us an email to director@dfw.wa.gov, and we'll try to follow up with any specific areas that you have, or put you in touch with our local district wildlife biologist. Let's stay on the theme here of elk management. Randy asks, did the department consider the late winter and the potential that elk may have been in higher country and not at the feeding stations when reducing elk permits in the Yakima area?
Yes, we did. Our biologist, did the work that was needed, I think, to get out into the district and really look for elk numbers and determine what was going on. And there was concerns for reduced numbers and the impact there. So I believe we considered that in our thought process and felt that the proper recommendation was to make that reduction.
Okay. Yep. Let's see here. Jumping back to steelhead, Ray asked, will the department apply for a steelhead brood stocking permit through NOAA for the Snohomish River Basin?
That's one we're going to have to get back to you on. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
To do a little
research on that.
So Ray, if you would, please send us that email to director@DFW, and we'll follow up with you. Let's see here, a couple other questions have come in. Dennis asked, what is the department doing to provide more river access in our state for salmon and steelhead? I'm thinking a couple folks might be able to respond to that. Tim, do you want to talk about some of the additional access areas?
Yeah, as I indicated in my briefing, we've got another $6 million for the next biennium to improve our access sites around the state. We're currently working on 13 projects that we have active, so pretty significant workload for improvement of boating access.
Jeff, maybe.
Yeah, I'll throw in a little bit more. I'm also aware there's some local governments that are looking at public access, so maybe not DFW owned and constructed and operated, but some of the local governments, I'm thinking like Pierce County is looking at development of public access to the rivers in their jurisdiction.
And I might add, we had a topic earlier about land acquisition was covered, as well as this access thing. And so just a point that, the department looks for opportunities from willing sellers when it comes to land acquisition and for providing property that would provide access. So we're always looking for willing sellers that provide the right opportunity and the right time, and then we pull that into our Lands 2020 process. And so encourage anybody out there who has a bead on a location that might make a good acquisition or a good access site to work with the local regional office staff. And then as we evaluate that, we can pull it into our Lands 2020 process, and that begins sometimes a multi-year process of evaluating opportunity and pulling together the right funding sources to make a deal final and then make that happen. So that's how we operate, and sometimes it takes quite a while, but it really starts with identifying the opportunity and that willing landowner seller.
We've had some really good partnerships with private industrial timber, like the 7400 road access in Grays Harbor County. We've submitted applications through the Farm Bill, actually, to pursue grant funding from the Voluntary Public Access and Habitat Improvement Program to specifically try to do knock and talk with landowners to provide fishing access. So we're working this issue on a wide variety of fronts, whether it's improving conditions on our lands, looking for increasing our portfolio, or working with partners. So access is just an increasing challenge, whether it's on fishing or on the hunting side. The number one complaint for hunters is, where can I go? So that's definitely front and center for a lot of our staff's work plans. Kevin asks if we could provide an update on elk hoof disease in Southwest Washington.
I can try. I don't know if I have much of an update. It certainly still is present. We're working with the university, who's taken the lead on studying kind of the cause and trying to make sure we fully understand the disease and potential management actions there. But it's still present, as we've seen some spread of elk hoof disease into kind of surrounding areas. We attempted to do some removals last year to get out ahead of that, to see if we could, get to that herd before it could potentially contaminate the grounds or other elk. We were only somewhat successful in that effort. As in response, the department, as we track hoof disease around the state, has expanded our regulation around leaving hooves in the field, and so that's all west of the Cascade Crest. Hunters will be asked to leave elk hooves in the field this year. We're evaluating the effectiveness of that and kind of considering if we would maintain that type of program, and if so, would we extend it to a statewide program. But the prevalence and the persistence of hoof disease in that area of the state is still there and still strong, and we're still trying to learn more about it and see if there's anything we can do to effectively manage it.
Okay. The next question is from Mitch, and Mitch asks, why doesn't the department require our employees to be hunters or fishers?
Well, I'll give you the bureaucratic straight answer first, and that's that I don't know that I can have that authority. more importantly, I think hunters and fishers are very well represented amongst the employees in this agency. I think the vast majority either hunt or fish or potentially both. So I think the hunters and fishers perspective is well represented. But I don't want to lose the opportunity either. I think part of the problem we suffer when we go to the legislature for money, part of the problem we suffer when we look to the broader population is they think this agency is just about hunting and fishing. And we have a conservation element. You heard Jeff talk about it. I think we have to realize that fish and wildlife provide a benefit to every citizen in this state, whether you hunt or fish or not. And we need to get that awareness out there and then that support from that broader base in order for us to be successful to manage fish and wildlife. And if we're successful at managing those populations and fish and wildlife in general, we will have more opportunity for hunters and fishers. But it's not just about hunters and fishers. And I think that focus has done a disservice for us when we try to appeal to the broader public, because it is more about that. There is healthy habitats, healthy populations of wild animals, which is healthy human populations. So that's what we got to get to, I think. That said, I'd certainly encourage everybody in the department to go hunting and fishing. I know I like to.
This is a pretty detailed reg question here, but it's from Tina, who asks, why is there only one moose tag for youth?
I don't know that I can answer that other than just limited numbers, and so we try to spread our opportunities out across the different interest groups and user groups, and so how many we can carve out of any particular species to a particular user group is part of our public process and public discussion, and so and I know that encouraging youth hunting is certainly important for our hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation, R3. But those first opportunities don't necessarily have to be with such a specialty species such as moose. And so, we can look to a lot of other areas and other species in the state to develop that kind of beginner hunter and support youth in hunting with limited opportunity, I guess, in kind of these very limited special tag species. So, but I'd have to go back to the regions to get specifically about their number, distribution, and why, and we could provide more detailed information.
Okay. So it looks like we've got a couple more questions. We'll probably do a final call for questions. This next one is from Dennis. How about having boats pay for launch access on the Cowlitz River to help with costs? So I'm not sure which costs is thinking of, and we can talk maybe a little about the Discover Pass, Eric, or Vehicle Access Pass.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, it's certainly something that we've actually talked about. I think, I know that State Parks charges a $5 launch fee in addition to the Discover Pass. The department doesn't currently do that. We historically have always offered our Access Pass that comes with hunting and fishing licenses, and that's a kind of a service or an item that our sportsmen and women are used to receiving with that. And the Discover Pass was added on top of that, and so we're looking at our how we ask our constituents to pay, and we're kind of hitting them up in those areas already. But certainly there's an example with state parks where they charge that additional launch fee, and it's something that we have talked about, and its potential for the future, and it would certainly provide additional fund source for either access programs or wherever we wanted to direct it from that collection.
See here, the last question, or I've got another one here, but let's see here. Andrew asks, after the decision to eliminate Skamania stock summer steelhead from the Skykomish River, is there an alternative for a summer fishery for steelhead?
For that specific stock?
Yeah, it's I think it's referring to the settlement, and then is there an alternative for summer fishery for steelhead after the decision to eliminate the Skamania stock program from the Skykomish?
Yeah, we will still be able to prosecute summer steelhead fisheries. I don't have the specific details, but we can certainly get those to you, Nate, and we can get that information out there. But the the summer steelhead fisheries in Puget Sound are not gone. So I think that's important for folks to know.
Right. Good. Thanks, Kelly. Melissa asks, are we still emphasizing outreach, education, better husbandry, and personal responsibility to avoid and minimize conflicts with large carnivores?
Yes, we certainly are. I talked a little bit earlier about the role of our conflict specialist around the state, and that's one of their primary objectives. And I think we have quite a bit of information on our web page about living with wildlife. Yep.
Another suggestion here, individual rights. Should we stop giving reduced fishing rates to seniors and military? Should we limit the amount of salmon and steelhead cards a person can have? With the intent that this might spread out the resources to more people. So maybe Kelly Cunningham, do you want to talk about some of the different things we've looked at over the years about some of those different discounts and catch record cards?
Yeah, I can't speak to how we've addressed them over the years. I would say that I think those are important programs. That when I think about veterans and I think about discounts to veterans, I think I think those are good programs. I think discounts to youth, nationwide, we're seeing a decline in people coming into hunting and fishing, and I think the discount programs that the various states offer for youth are a good way to try to incentivize, getting into the field and experiencing hunting and fishing, and hopefully hooking those folks, no pun intended, for a lifetime of fishing or hunting for that matter. So I personally value those programs. I think they're good programs. And what was the second part of the question?
Yeah, the second question is, should we limit the amount of salmon and steelhead cards a person can have? And so I think we've heard suggestions about limiting the number of rows, for instance.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a tough balance, right? Because we had previous questions about, you're charging me more for less opportunity. I think there are a lot of people who would feel like that would be less opportunity. I think back to the 15-17 biennium where we went forward with the fee bill and tried to propose a similar but different approach to that, which was charging for a second catch record card, and that was met with a lot of public pushback. So I think it's something that we need to continue to think about, especially if we see, declines in returns, similar to what we've seen this year. But I'm not sure we're there yet with limiting somebody to a single catch record card.
And so this is going to be our last question. Has the department looked at requiring hunters to select either the west side or the east side of the state when hunting deer?
I guess I don't know if historically we've looked. I'm seeing that we haven't necessarily pursued that. I know it's certainly not something that's on our radar to really do. It's important for our elk management because of the limited hunt opportunities. We have to be able to regulate where the harvest occurs and better account for that, and it's important for our season setting for that species. And for deer, we haven't had that specific need. But as we launch into our next 3-year season setting package, those are the kinds of things that if we get suggestions from the public, we always can evaluate them and see if there'd be some benefit or management value in doing that, and we can certainly incorporate that. And so if there's an interest by somebody out there to have us really consider that, I would say they need to drop us that message through our email, and we'll put it into our file folder for the 3-year package, and we can consider it in our season setting.
Good. Thanks, Eric. Director, do you have any closing remarks for the evening?
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody, especially those that have stayed with us for this long webinar. I hope it's been informative. Again, we're looking to improve this process, so if you have ideas for improvement, let us know. Also, if you have particular topics you'd like to cover at a future webinar, let us know that, and we'll make sure that gets attended to as well. Other than that, thank you all. I hope we have your continued support as we kind of try to turn things around and provide more opportunity in the state for hunting and fishing.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say thank you as well for attending tonight. Thanks for everybody that joined the director on the panel tonight. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll have it posted for folks to review by tomorrow morning. Like to thank you for joining us this evening. Have a great night.